all year we've been doing, for the whole year, we've been doing aesthetics, the qualitative research on aesthetics. And every time there's been a presenter, I've gone through everyone that has done it, but now the list has got too long. So I'll just point out we've been doing this for a year. We'll probably continue on this theme a little bit in the next semester, but then we're just going to open up to whatever anyone has to present that's interesting and that would be interesting to secret members. We have one more speaker coming, and that's Erica Doss. Now, she's the external speaker in the sense from outside the area. We usually have three categories of speakers, you might say. Those from Duquesne, those from the universities in the area, such as Suzanne, and then people that come from far away. And the person coming next is Erica Doss, and she's in the Department of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She's published a number of books. I'll just mention one that I've read, which is Memorial Mania. And it's an incredibly interesting book on monuments in the US, more contemporary ones, both in terms of the sort of emotionality of different types of memorials, but also the political social meaning of the memorials. And so we'll be looking forward to her visit. You'll all be receiving emails on it, but it's April 3rd. We'll have her public address, and then on the 4th, we'll have a smaller symposium here. And if you're interested in the symposium, then there's a paper to read beforehand, and Nathan is the person that you contact to get that paper once we get it, right? So,
I'm keeping a list.
Great, keeping it down. I'll be sending out the announcements. If your name is on this, you'll be on that list, so you'll get Ian's email address and everything you need to know about when the event's going to occur. I mentioned Erica Doss's book, Memorial Mania. There's another book that I like very much. It's called Out of Rubble, and this is done by Suzanne Slavick, who's our speaker for today, and I'll say a little bit more about it, but I'm going to pass this book around. She has some copies if anyone's interested that they can pick up from her. But that, just go ahead and take a look at it. And let's see, I'll get my act together a little better here. Yeah, so now I'm going to actually do the introduction here. Now that I've got my papers together for it. Suzanne is Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Art at Carnegie Mellon University. She's editor and curator of Out of Rubble, the book that's being passed around right now, which is also a traveling exhibit featuring international artists who respond to the aftermath of war. And she's a recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Pennsylvania Council of the Arts. She's exhibited internationally, both at centers and galleries. For example, the Chicago Cultural Center, the McDonough Museum in Youngstown, Cola Griffin Gallery in New York City, Bernstein Gallery at Princeton University. She studied at Yale University, but also, which interests me a lot, is at the university in Poland as well. I don't think we ever talked about that.
That was just a summer program.
And in the Tyler School of Art at Temple University in Rome, and also in Philadelphia, of course. Her articles and visual essays have appeared in Cairo, Images of Transition, Cultural Heritage and Arts Review, Cultural Politics, Frontiers, that is a journal of women's studies, and Guernica, a magazine of art and politics, and Alternet. And I've known Suzanne now for some years, and I'm just really happy to have you here to share your work with us today.
Thank you, Fred. I'm just going to turn off the lights so the images are a little stronger.
Will you be able to see the presenter if the lights are off?
Oh, well, you don't need to see me. It's the images.
Suzanne, do not see me.
What?
I said that was funny. It was like, you don't need to see me.
Okay.
We're going to the images later via PowerPoint. So
Oh,
she kind of.
so you want the lights on then?
Can you just have like one on?
There's actually a few
Okay,
different
here.
options.
Yeah, we couldn't
I'm
have
wondering
used
about
that.
this. There are less
Yeah, the
bright
ones
ones.
at the, there.
That's the one right on the screen.
That's just gonna backlight.
Is that better on?
Turn off one of them.
Get all of them around.
Have Polish descent.
Try the other switch up.
Yeah, kind of. I mean,
Yeah, and then you
I
turn,
was just told that
and then
today
turn
is
those
a
off.
is a saint's
Right.
day for Polish people.
I don't think that's gonna help her, but,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
Is that okay?
Another one.
Getting a little better.
That's all right.
There
He's the light man.
it is.
Don't
said
you
her.
know?
You know, you gotta like not be afraid to get on a ladder and do it.
All right, I think I'll go ahead and start. So I want to thank Fred and Seeker for inviting me here today, and for those of you who came out this afternoon. And I'm just going to jump right in and say that this whole project, as both a book and a curatorial project, grew out of my own work as an artist, and I'm not an art critic or a historian, and I've really only recently begun curating. And the seeds of this project really came out of some of my earlier paintings like this. This is called Amnesia Embellished. And some of those paintings sort of proposed and critiqued the conditions that I think contribute to war, and one of those is a collective amnesia, because we seem to prefer bloodbaths to, losing the circulation in our brains and our bodies, and here you see the thumb turning blue from loss of circulation, rather than remembering the lessons of history. And the intellectual pacifism that I grew up with became emotional during the first Gulf War when I became a mother. My son was born the same year as that first Gulf War. And at the time, sort of pietas seemed to be the only possibility as I tried to imagine any mother sending their child off to war. So this here is my pietà that's partially based on these emptied out shapes of antique maps that often referred to human organs, even if they're stylized, like this heart-shaped map. And the little angelic directional winds that you see on the right map, those became breast shields that were weeping milk tears that follow the trajectories of missiles into this black void. And the latitudes on the source maps become these concentric rings that function as a target. And also the heart, which we think of, it's the metaphorical locus of love. It's overlaid with these diagrams of aggression. And the top black chart that you see is the Joint Forces chain of command, and the bottom red design or plan that you see is the battle plan that supposedly won the first Gulf War. And that battle plan, weirdly, is called the Hail Mary, which I think is a strange kind of co-opting of a maternal, sacred prayer for this. It's also the name of a football play, as you all know from, who's the guy, the famous, yes, thank you,
Yes.
yeah. I can't remember his name.
Michael Harris.
Thank you, yes, anyway. So in 2006, with wars raging in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon, and I'm sure elsewhere, I shifted gears from working with straight oil painting and launched into experimenting with some digital media, and I began this R&R project. I was sort of trying to find some kind of constructive stance or response to the imagery of the reporting of war that I was seeing, and taking that military expression, rest and recuperation, R&R, and converting them into titles like reveal, recovery, restore, rue, all kinds of R words. And I wanted to sort of counter art historical and contemporary media representations of war with restorative gestures or interventions. So I started by using these sort of documentary photographs that I found on the internet, and started by simply painting back in the roads and the bridges that had been destroyed. And I had always loved Islamic art. As a grad student, I looked a lot at Persian miniatures. I kind of let it go for several decades, and then began poring over it again during this project, looking at the art of current areas of conflict that happened to fall within the former Islamic Empire, which stretched all the way from India to Spain, as you all know. And I turned especially to this master painter, Kamal Uddin Behzad, who is the most influential painter that, of what we call miniatures. They didn't call them miniatures, but we do. And just to place him historically, he's a contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci. And to show cultures building themselves, I borrowed scenes like this one on the right. This piece is called Building the Great Mosque of Samarkand, and that has its own complicated history that I could speak about separately, but I'm going to skip that now. But I took that scene and painted it rising from the rubble of Beirut that was bombed by the IDF in 2006. And I painted the figures in a kind of ghostly, semi-transparent gouache. This is a watercolor, but it's semi-opaque. And making them ghostly seems to maybe relegate them to the past, but I think ghosts return. That's part of their nature. And I also wanted to show how that despite the debilitating chaos, the constructive impulse persists. And so this project drew me to other artists who are working today who also address the aftermath of war, and their work became the heart of this book and the show that's traveling, that Fred mentioned. It's going to 8 venues around the country. And beginning the project, I kind of struggled with my own introduction to trauma studies and issues surrounding how we represent pain and suffering and violence and war. And one of the references that I came across was Leo Bersani's book, The Culture of Redemption, and he is a little suspicious of art's claim to redeem or to salvage damaged experience, and that somehow art can redeem life, and he thinks that claim is misguided and arrogant. And I'm just glossing over these references, but this is one of the reasons that I wanted to draw examples from the images of culture rebuilding themselves. And again, a construction scene, again from Behzad, that's on the left and transposed. And so through this, I'm sort of trying to bridge these cultural divides that are both real and constructed. And I'm certainly not trying to assume the stance of coming to the rescue or fixing everything. I don't want to make that claim. But for me, incorporating this kind of imagery from the former Islamic Empire is one way of dispelling the kind of prevalent stereotypical notions of regions and religions that are often seen solely as proponents of a kind of malignant fundamentalism. And I also wanted to counter the endless media images of militancy and martyrdom by combining images of a culture's aspirations and its efforts to cultivate with evidence of its eradication. And the furthest thing that I want to say in any of this, because some people have critiqued this project, I'm not trying to say that war ennobles humanity in any way. It certainly doesn't, and though some may act humanely or even heroically, war, I think, simply dehumanizes. I mean, and I also don't want to propagate the myth that those who survive war are somehow superior either. As consoling as that may be, that's just not the case. Anyway, some of the issues that I struggled with, I think were really well addressed in this catalog for a 2006 show at Williams College called Beautiful Suffering, addressing how we present suffering. And Mika Ball, in her essay in this book, the essay's The Pain of Images, she tells us, and we know this ourselves, that it's only natural that we identify with or empathize with images of pain or suffering like this. But she also talks about how that tendency can be appropriative or exploitative, and that if we identify with or take over the suffering, that we can sort of in effect consume it and erase the difference between ourselves and the sufferer and somehow sort of cheapen and cancel it out. And then Elaine Scarry, in The Body and Pain, she discusses pain in more than medical terms. She talks about pain as an aspect of war, torture, and other explicitly political acts. She talks about how pain is inexpressible, how it destroys language, and how it leaves the sufferer in absolute isolation. And she also talks about how pain unmakes the world, and then how our creative making works against pain and all of its debasing uses. So working in this terrain, I think maybe the best that artists can strive for is what Dominic LaCapra calls empathic unsettlement. And it's not a complicated idea. It's the idea that while we simultaneously feel for another, we remain aware of the distinction between our own perception and the actual experience of another. So this is a piece that I think works toward that end. It's by an Iraqi artist, Adel Abidine. It's a video installation called Construction Site, and it's of a girl that he found playing right after a street in Baghdad had been bombed. And she's sort of sifting these bits of debris back and forth between these plastic spoons while singing a song. And the rubble in front of the video projection is real, it's physical. But we also know when we see this that we're in a gallery and we are safe from any actual harm. So she's trapped on the screen, she's trapped in a real world of random violence. She's also lost in perhaps the world of her own imagination. Maybe it's the only way that she can cope or preserve her sanity. So we empathize as a viewer, but Abidine, I think, keeps us aware of our distinction from her by putting the real rubble in front of the representation. So in that sense, I think he's inducing what Le Copper calls empathic unsettlement, because we cannot really live her pain. So I'm sure all the philosophers and historians in this room already know this, but much of the theory about aestheticizing tragedy and how we represent pain and suffering, of course, stems from Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno. And Benjamin condemned photographs of misery that were presented as objects of consumption. And Adorno in the late 40s argued that if you beautify the political realities of war or violence, that you are colluding with the destruction of the world. And that if violence becomes somehow appealing, it's unwittingly redeemed or tamed or erased. But in his later negative dialectics, he said, quote, "Perennial suffering has as much right to expression as a tortured man has to scream." So these, end quotes. So these arguments about aestheticizing tragedy have been clarified and modified and displaced over time, and tomes have been written about what was really meant then and what was meant later, and I'm not going to dwell on them any further, but I just want to mention that. And I think some artists are oblivious to this minefield of representation. I think some stomp across it, some tiptoe tentatively, some try to sweep or clear the mines, and I mean all this, of course, metaphorically, but it still matters. And I think, you know, in working on this, I tried to ask, you know, how can artists avoid these traps of representation? What can we accomplish if we do or don't? Can we bear witness while doing no further harm, and if so, how? So some would argue that it's not the images or the media used by artists that anesthetizes us to these images of pain or suffering, that even before we approach a work of art, that we're either detached or sympathetic or empathetic to start with. It's in, you know, the nature of the viewer. But that what does harden us to tragedy and suffering is just the sheer number of representations that bombard us daily, whether they're beautiful or ugly. And so, conscious of her own distance from the actual horrors of war, this artist, Atlanta-based Rocio Rodriguez, her paintings and drawings are attempts to resist the numbness and the amnesia and all the other defenses that we develop, even when we willfully and frequently expose ourselves to the coverage or documentation of war. And sometimes that distance that we develop, I think, arises from the aerial perspective that is commonly used in reportage. The uniqueness of suffering or survival is often obliterated from this perspective because it's the point of view of surveillance and satellite mapping. It guarantees a kind of detachment, and it makes it impossible to see the actual flesh wounds or anything visceral. And this Pakistani-born artist who now lives in Toronto, Samina Mansouri, she uses this bird's eye view throughout her Ash archive to reveal how we consume images of war from afar and how that mutes the horror. And her ruins are actually constructed from tabletop models and then manipulated further in Photoshop, and you'll see this again in Bilal's work later. So artists continue to grapple with these claims that beauty somehow co-opts or minimizes tragedy, and we worry that beauty might make the damage too bearable, too easily digested, dismissible. And also some people say that images of damage overwhelm us. They leave us feeling passive or powerless rather than activating us to change the situation. So I think, artists can feel damned if we do and damned if we don't. And I'm not willing to abandon beauty. And so this piece, for example, this ornamental border that you see, it actually comes from this Persian portrait of a Chinese diplomat. And so it's not really obvious to the viewer, but it's my sort of implicit advocacy for diplomacy over the force that we so often resort to, and that leads to air bomb bridges like this one. And so in this scene, I'm thinking of this border as representing a kind of impossible structure that rises, it's beautiful amidst the stupidity of war, and maybe by being so, I'm hoping it recalls us to our better nature. And David Levi-Strauss, in his essay, I can't remember the name of it right now, but he argues that aestheticization is one of the ways that disparate peoples recognize themselves in one another. That he questions the presumption that the more transformed or aestheticized an image is, the less authentic or politically valuable it becomes. He asks instead, why can't beauty be a call to action? And he goes on to say, quote, to represent is to aestheticize, that is, to transform. It presents a vast field of choices, but it does not include the choice not to transform, not to change or alter whatever is being represented. It cannot be a pure process in practice. This goes for photography as for any other means of representation, end quote. The essay is the documentary debate, aesthetic or anesthetic. So many of the images in Out of Rubble are photographic or dependent on photographic sources. And again, going back to the curators of the Beautiful Suffering show, Holly Edwards and Mark Reinhardt, they caution us to be careful of the trust that we still place in photographs. Even though we know they can be manipulated, we still regard them as somehow more factual. And they warn us because they say, quote, they can harbor diverse illusions and excuses, that we need look no further to understand distant events, or that, quote, structural violence requires only some personal emotional response, that the represented pain or calamity has already been resolved and therefore can be dismissed, or that addressing the problem is our privilege in the first place, as either an artist or as the audience. And so the photographic source and altering it, again, risks subduing the horror depicted, but I think this is exactly what Curtis Mann is addressing through these overt manipulations of photographs by processing them with bleach that's kind of thrown on the emulsion, so you get these sort of random erasures, and it erases some of the information, showing how photographs can never really capture the whole truth and how representation of reality is so malleable. So the book was actually inspired and organized by the stanzas of the Polish Nobel laureate poet Wislawa Szymborska. It's called The End and the Beginning, and it's about the aftermath of war and all the stages of remembering, recovery, reconstruction, forgetting, and dreaming again. And I'll read it because we can never really, I think we never get enough poetry. So after every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. We'll need the bridges back and new railway stations. Sleeves will go ragged from rolling them up. Someone, broom in hand, still recalls the way it was. Someone else listens and nods with unsevered head. But already there are those nearby starting to mill about who will find it dull. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road so the corpse-filled wagons can pass. Someone has to get mired in scum and ashes, sofa springs, splintered glass, and bloody rags. Someone has to drag in a girder to prop up a wall. Someone has to glaze a window, rehang a door. Photogenic it's not, and takes years. All the cameras have left for another war. From out of the bushes, sometimes someone still unearths rusted out arguments and carries them to the garbage pile. Those who knew what was going on here must make way for those who know little and less than little, and finally, as little as nothing. In the grass that is overgrown causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in his mouth, gazing at the clouds. So I start the book with artists whose work forbids our forgetting, like Szymborska's Someone Who Still Recalls the Way It Was. And Anselm Kiefer is one artist who has plumbed the origins and the infliction and the aftermath of World War II, melding matter and history in facing its unfathomable ruins. And he has said, quote, "The ruins, the dust, this is where I begin from." He examines the mythological sources for what led to the horrors of the Holocaust and also to the destruction of the land and civilian populations and environments. And W.G. Sebald tells us, he gets very specific, 31.1 cubic meters of rubble for each person in Cologne, 42.8 cubic meters per person in Dresden, 3.5 million homes were destroyed, 7.5 million were homeless, and this, of course, is on top of the genocide. So such finite quantification points to failure of immense, if not infinite proportions, and all of this suffuses Kiefer's work as he addresses survival, its miracle, and its burden. And by the way, Sebald, to conjure an aesthetic effect from the remnants of such destruction is to make the real horrors of time disappear through the artifice of abstraction. And reminding us that the art of catastrophe is often a device for banishing the memory of human misery. Sebald's short book, it's called On the Natural History of Destruction. It's really a plea to restore the moral dimension of ruins. And so it's all the more for artists to wrestle with. The rubble in Kiefer's piece, I think, is not static. It's heavy, yes, it's raw and ragged materials which are real and not abstract, suggest a collapsed structure or state even. But I think its wave movement suggests a kind of aftershock. And Kiefer's work often sort of verges on these biblical imperatives like from Isaiah's "let the earth open," because his work is full of cracks and fissures, but there are these openings that a life force can still heave from and refill the empty spaces. And there are a lot of empty spaces to be refilled. And this is Pamela Wilson Rickman using a lot of negative blank shapes in the rubble. And Julie Meritou, like Kiefer, has also been described as a kind of connoisseur of ruins. And these are works that she completed in Berlin where you can still see traces of the war on a daily basis, the bullet holes in the walls and the fortifications. And though she's not literally depicting ruins, I think she's suggesting the residue of our self-destruction and of these sort of transitional spaces of cities that are transformed over years and with immense resources from these hazy ruins to these kind of burgeoning meccas like Berlin, for example. Whereas British artist Simon Norfolk, he approaches rubble through Mikhail Bakhtin's notion of the chronotope, which is a time space, a place that displays the layeredness of time. And his book, Chronotopia, Landscapes of the Destruction of Afghanistan, connects the archaeological evidence of decades of war in the landscape to the story of human disaster. So a building, for example, that's been reduced to rubble by thousands of Kalashnikov bullets is very different from a landscape that's been air bombed. And so he kind of reveals this. He's kind of like the registrar of this museum of destruction. This piece is a bullet-scarred outdoor cinema in Kabul, and I think it reminds us how absurdly distant our daily human pleasures become when the bombs are falling. And that, you know, the silver screen here is silent and it's sapped of all dreams. And if there is any silver lining in war, it may be for the brick factories that he also photographed at Husan Keel, which is east of Kabul, because years of massive damage have created a soaring demand for bricks to rebuild. So this black smoke is ominous, but it's actually a sign of reconstruction. Another theme in Out of Rubble is damaged homes and families. This is a piece by the Scottish artist Helen de Man, and she went to Palestine, and she's representing 7 members of the Abbasi family with pedestals of different heights and flesh colors. And their home in Silwan, which is still a contested site where Jewish and Arab residents contest each other's claims and narratives, this home was destroyed by the Jerusalem municipality in 2009. And so she's presenting these kind of shifting readings of Rubble as sites of eviction, occupation, of ruin, and reconstruction. And she got the family's permission to cast chunks of the rubble of their home in bronze. And of course, bronze is a material that we associate with commemoration, medals, monuments. And so in this way, she's kind of conferring a permanence and a status, cultural status on these fragments to resist the erasure of a people or a culture. I think another artist that works with fragments but of texts, this is Mary Kelly. She's offering these partial glimpses of atrocities that I think are, quite difficult to stomach. But initially, when you look at these, I initially felt quite detached. It's not because they're relying on the aerial perspective, but there's a kind of visual monotony. They're kind of bland. But as the words sink in, that initial neutrality, I think, grows into this sickening feeling in the gut. And especially that feeling we feel when we feel guilt. And the series is called Mea Culpa, which is the Latin phrase for through my fault. Catholic University, you all should know that. But she's drawing a lot of different documents from atrocities in Cambodia, Sarajevo, Palestine, South Africa. And the texts that she selects are then embossed in soft dry lint that she collects from washing 4,000 pounds of black and white clothing, which is another way of evoking the incessant daily labor of women. And the banality of lint combines with this block lettering to dispassionately spell out a really horrific scene between a mother and child in Sarajevo. And the whole quote is, "A few bathroom tiles and the smell of burning, nothing else left. Probing the ashes, she retrieved a family photograph. The faces scratched out with a drill bit. She rocked back and forth on her heels. What will we do? Slit their throats," said her 4-year-old son. So through all, I think, that is rote and routine in our lives, I think Kelly manages to both indict and subvert our detachment from the conditions that perpetuate such trauma, whether it's through our indifference, our hubris, our ill will, for whatever reason. And for me, this becomes a gut-wrenching piece that speaks to the emotional rubble that war leaves behind. And a couple of the artists in the project work with returning veterans. This is Jennifer Karati's Soldier Stories from Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a 5-year project where she worked with them to reenact moments, dramatic moments from their tours of duty. And the resulting tableaux are, I think, both poignant and jarring. This is a father in a very defensive posture in his own backyard. This is his family. I think he's got 7 kids there. And these images are also accompanied by the veterans' own words in their stories, and they reveal a host of conflicting and unresolved emotions. And Monica Holler also ran workshops in what she called the Veterans Book Project, working with them to combine all their photographs and stuff they brought home with them to make books that, sort of encapsulate their memories that are both vivid and fading. And so for both Karati and Heller, I think they, in a sense, were working as embedded artists on the home front, and rather than on the battlefront. I think another artist that speaks to the home front in another way is Osman Khan, Pakistani-born, now lives in Michigan. And in his piece, we're standing under a monitor with very stylized chunks of rubble raining down over us. I mean, they're pretty bland also, abstracted, but they come from the house of Abu al-Aish. And this cycle of the animation for him is sort of mirroring the mass media's treatment of such imagery because they play them over and over again until they either lose meaning or until we turn off the TV or until a new news cycle begins. But the events that he's referring to are anything but abstract. This is Dr. Alai. She is a real Palestinian doctor and peace activist who trained in Israel. And here he is weeping in a Tel Aviv hospital after he was evacuated from the Gaza Strip in January 2009, where his home, which was sheltering 18 people, was shelled by the IDF warring against Hamas. And 2 of his daughters and his niece were killed. Now, some of you may have heard this on NPR. They had him live on the radio while this was happening. It was just gut-wrenching. And ironically, he's also a doctor who's an academic who has studied the effects of war on both Gazan and Israeli children. The Chinese artist Zhu Bing is also working with concrete damage, but also to maybe offer a less concrete lesson in this piece called Where Does the Dust Collect? And it's from 2004, and it's meant to examine what truth might mean among conflicting perspectives. And so what he did is he cast the ashen residue that he collected from the streets of Lower Manhattan after the September 11th fall of the towers. He cast that dust into the form of a doll. And he did this because the material is potentially toxic, and this way he could transport it through customs to various countries where he could then reconvert it into this installation you'll see in a minute. So the ingredients of the doll are then ground up in a coffee grinder, and then they're blown with a leaf blower over a stenciled passage of poetry by Hui Neng, who lived from 638 to 713. He was the 6th patriarch of Zen Buddhism in China. And Hui Neng questioned the teachings of his predecessor, who was very didactic and absolute, and who his predecessor claimed to understand the faith in all its purity. His poetry is declarative rather than inquisitive, and you can hear the certainty in this little phrase: the body is the Bodhi tree, the soul is like the mirror bright. Take heed to keep it always clean, and let no dust collect upon it. Whereas Hui Neng is questioning. He rewrites the poem in a sense. He cannot see the bright mirror or the pure soul, and he doesn't know how the dust can settle upon it or how the soul becomes impure. And so moral certainty and true wisdom, as represented by the Bodhi tree, remains elusive. And he counters the hard line of his predecessor by saying the Bodhi is not like the tree. The mirror bright is nowhere shining. And there is nothing from the first. Where does the dust itself collect? And you see this last line in this field of dust, inviting us to trade certainty for doubt and to question our rigid stances and oppositions and their consequences. And I think Wafa Bilal uses dust and ash to portray those consequences. What he does is he builds these miniature sets based on photographs from his native Iraq, including this one, which is an actual photograph of a chair left standing in a ruined palace of Saddam Hussein. It's not the actual photograph, he's mimicking the photograph. The rubble in the set contains 21 grams of human ashes, which is mixed with other organic cinders. And if any of you have seen that film by Inaritu, The 21 Grams, it's based on this discredited notion of Dr. Duncan McDougall that when your body dies, it loses 21 grams of weight because that's the weight of your soul departing. And Bilal's own brother Haj was killed by a predator drone attack in Al-Kufa, Iraq, and his father died weeks later of grief. So this is personal to him, and he is invoking body and soul through the ashes, through this 21 grams reference, to reinforce the subjective in face of journalism's claim to objectivity. And he's trying to insist on the human costs in face of terms like collateral damage. And Szymborska, again, on media and war. Photogenic it's not and takes years. All the cameras have left for another war. So Bilal is one of the many artists who is commenting on photography's immediacy, but also its artificiality in representing war, because he's blending the fake and the real in building these maquettes and then in the subsequent photographs. So in a sense, his process is reflecting both the success and the failure of how we represent war and how we shape our response to it. This is a painter from Boston, Elaine Spatz-Rabinowitz, who also draws from photojournalism. She blends references across time and place, from Auschwitz to Afghanistan, sort of speaking to the continuity of war. And you can't tell from this slide because it's got nice clean edges, but it's a big rough chunk of plaster that she paints very meticulously on, and it almost looks like a chunk of rubble itself. And in some of her paintings, you can almost smell the reek of burning oil and tires. But she's using these really heavy hydrocal surfaces that are embedded with pigments and charcoal and old plaster patinas, and creating these fields for incidents of both arbitrary and deliberate violence. And I think what this kind of work does that photographs can't do is that it makes the damage tactile. It gives it a physical weight. And on the other hand, Enrique Castrejón, who is Mexican, now lives in LA, it's lighter physically, it's made out of paper, but his subject is not lighter at all. This is called Wasteland Najaf, and it's a kind of a huge wall collage. It's about 10 feet wide. And ironically, the pandemonium of war is actually recreated here by these geometric calculations. If you look at the details, he annotates all these measurements on fragments of found paper, and then he reassembles it with hundreds of pins and tape. So the whole thing hangs together in this kind of provisional, impermanent state and almost seems about to collapse. And I think it's a kind of breaking down of visual representation that, in a sense, might be the only appropriate response to senseless violence, much like the Dadaists responded with absurdity. And I think the analytical nature of his process, again, becomes almost absurd in how it's trying to balance this disintegration and reintegration. And it really can't find any rhyme or reason, and it really can't patch things back together or resurrect. And then moving away from sort of physical transcriptions of photographs, this artist, Thomas Roof, he chooses the computer over the camera and the web over the world. And this is from a series that he calls the JPEG series. And he's manipulating these images he found on the web that are both idyllic and catastrophic. And by enlarging really low-res JPEGs, the images become radically transformed, because these end up being about, 8 feet tall. So from afar, you recognize them as these somber spectacles of media saturation, where we've all seen this image. And as you move closer, they become these rectilinear clusters of varying tones. And then when you get really close, they totally break down into abstract pixelation. And so this degeneration of the image parallels the disintegration of the structures that he's depicting, and they resist recognition. And this happens in trauma, as Kathy Karoff in her essay, Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Trauma, asserts, quote, sometimes the most direct seeing of a violent event may occur as an absolute inability to know it, end quote. So in other words, it's so overwhelming that we can't process or absorb it. And so this extreme pixelation, I think, conveys Roof's understanding of photography's limits, that it can only offer us a skin of reality, that we're always distant from its substance, its body, and maybe its meaning. No matter how close we get, we can never really get past the surface. This is a little bit, I don't know if you'd call them artists, they're actually architects from a Beirut-based firm. And this is, I think, is a great example of after every war someone has to clean up, because they found a way to entrap rubble in these wire mesh cages to build temporary single-story multi-use structures at a fraction of the cost of other kinds of prefabricated housing. And in wartime, the roads are destroyed. You can't move the heavy machinery in or out to change anything. So this can be done without heavy machinery, and it can be done by the people in the locale itself. And this maybe is more conceptual. This is the collective decolonizing architecture, where they repurpose rubble in another way. This is called Project Return to Nature. And they are a group of architects, and architects do need spatial and political certainty in order to plan anything. And those conditions don't exist during wartime, and they don't exist at sites like this. This is Ush Grab. It's a decommissioned Israeli military base that has been cannibalized for construction materials, and it's been also used as a dumping ground for unwanted rubble. And what they did is they drilled holes in the walls and they shifted the ramparts to partially bury the buildings in the rubble of their own fortifications. So in effect, they've rendered the buildings totally unusable to prevent revolving door occupation. And so now it's a site that's only hospitable really to birds who happen to migrate in this area. I don't know where they're coming from, but they land on this hilltop, and they of course don't know any borders. And then moving from the actual to the imaginary, Lenka Clayton, who's actually based here in Pittsburgh, she digitally alters these images of Lebanese buildings bombed in 2006, and she partnered with a photojournalist. She didn't ask for any information from the photographer, just to send the pictures of the bombed buildings. And only using the information that she saw from that, she digitally repaired the buildings to what she thought they looked like originally. And you do have precedents for this kind of reversal of damage in the Lumiere brothers' 1896 screening of a film that they made where they demolished a wall and then they stunned the audiences by running the projector backwards and reversing the ruin. And then also Kurt Vonnegut did something similar in Slaughterhouse-Five, where he rewound an Allied bombing raid, so the bullets and the bombs are all flying back into the plane and so on. But still, in this series, when you get up close to them, you can see this kind of artificiality. They're kind of fragile, and they have this cutout quality, and they almost look more like stage sets rather than homes that you could actually move back into. So even though I think it's a lot about the healing power of our imaginations, things can never really be the way they were before. And Szymborska's poem again, "We'll Need the Bridges Back." These are contact prints that were made from actual rubbings from the Cocoa Bridge, which was miraculously left standing in a city park in Hiroshima after we dropped the atomic bomb. And the artist, who happens to be my sister Ellen, who's done a lot of work in Hiroshima, she flattens the dimensional, she dissects the intact, and then she reassembles the pieces. And I think it's a process that kind of echoes the history and the transformation of a larger city that has rebuilt itself. This is an installation by Suzanne, Chinese. He also goes by this collective name Made In Company, like as in Made in China. It's called Calm, and it also evokes regeneration because underneath is an air mattress, and it gently heaves, so the rubble is almost like breathing, and it kind of implies survival in this kind of gentle undulation. I only have two more artists, so I'm riding up here. I think Rubble is also transformed in other ways by Lida Abdul from Kabul, and she creates these performance-based videos that she stages in the ruins of Afghanistan. This piece in transit shows how children retrieve or repurpose the debris of war, turning them into objects of play and survival, sort of playing hope against the devastation. And in this piece called White House, she whitewashed the ruins of a former presidential palace on the outskirts of Kabul for 3 days. And it's a kind of Sisyphean task. Sisyphean task, yes. And it's, I think, also meant to be a kind of silent indictment of another faraway White House with its neoclassical columns that arise out of ideals of justice and democracy and freedom. But for her, I think painting the ruins white unifies and maybe, yes, beautifies them, and maybe masks the malevolent causes of the ruin. But I think the white also pronounces the ruins, and they become these stark reminders of how violence often corrupts even the loftiest of purposes and ends up imposing these absolutes of faith or ideology or empire. And she says, quote, she wants to answer, quote, those who see destruction as a solution to more difficult problems. At the same time, I wanted to preserve these ruins for the future, just as ruins, not monuments, end quote. And it's the opposite of a didactic monument, because bleaching the damage leaves them intact. It doesn't pretend to provide closure. They become these sort of elegant yet somber stages that we can project our own imagination onto against these kind of oblivious blue skies. And Szymborska's poem ends with gazing at the clouds, and I'm going to end with Tomoko Yoneda, who lives in Tokyo. She returns us to these former theaters of war. In this case, this is a pond created by a World War I explosion in Belgium, and it looks totally bucolic and beautiful now. Or even if it looks bland like this is a hill made of rubble from the Allied bombing of Berlin. So the current beauty or blandness of these scenes camouflages their history of trauma and strife. I think they demonstrate that, it's a cliche that time can heal wounds even if they're never forgotten, but that also in the midst and after catastrophe, the appeal of the ordinary becomes extraordinary and the end becomes the beginning. Thank you.
Suzanne, sure. Questions, comments, and just go ahead and answer.
No, I thank you very much for this. And I've looked at the book and gone through the pages and stuff, and something just sort of clicked for me actually when you were talking, and that is the relationship between visual perception and tactile, or tactile. And that's so emphasized in all this, that somehow visual perception, even like the prosthetic of photography, has failed in a certain way. And so a lot of these artists seem to be displacing the possibility of a redemptive response to a tactile, you get the sense of smell, you get, from looking at these different...
Or I think conceptually they're admitting and acknowledging and embracing those limitations of photography, like Bilal, I think, and Thomas Roof. I think they're not trying to overcome that limitation. They're revealing it,
Yeah. No, it's a very powerful motif through all of them. Yeah, it's really wonderful.
Question. So, before the talk, you and I were discussing the movie, The Act of Killing, and it occurred to me, for those of you who don't know of it, it's about a documentarian who gave cameras to former Indonesian warlords and asked them to document their killings in Indonesia. And it occurred to me while you were giving your talk that one of the powerful things about that documentary is how it makes the viewer kind of reenact the act as well, because of course while the Indonesian killings were going on, the U.S. supported them, and certainly people in the U.S. there weren't too many, if any, protests against them as far as I know. But there may be something similar going on in some of the work here in terms of how some of us during the Iraq War, the Afghan War, were, it was possibly person, but there wasn't a whole lot that we could do, or I guess maybe I'll just ask the question. Do you think there's a bit of the reaction between, or the interaction between the art and the viewer, that these sort of artists try to bring something out in terms of getting the viewer to reenact what they went through with the war, and if so, how effective do you think that was?
Well, I mean, I think it comes back to that idea of the empathic unsettlement, that you can try to evoke the situation or the damage, but you can't pretend that you're really reliving it. It's either a conceptual and or an emotional response, but it's from a distance. And I thought one thing that was curious about that film is, even though it's a we know it's a reenactment, and we also know the capabilities of special effects technicians now. The makeup and the disguises in that film were so obviously fake. I mean, deliberately so, whether it's because it was a lower budget film or not. But I think that, in a sense, too, was like Bilal's photographs admitting the artificiality of it, that this isn't the real thing. This is a retelling. It's a representation of it. And I think even the makeup was doing that, apart from the structure of how those reenactments fit within the film. And then also the kind of absurdity of those singing women in the pink, frothy dresses, I don't know if I answered your question though, about the audience reenacting.
Yeah, I'm just curious. maybe if you could just talk a little bit about some of the relationships you think the art in the book forms with the people who are watching it. I mean, you talked some in terms of how it that you can never actually experience it and tries to bring that part of it out, and how the that last one, the White House brings or evokes representations of the actual White House and its role in the Afghanistan war. But what sort of relationships do you think art forms with the viewer that may have political implications, empathetic implications, social implications going forward?
Well, I think that's really hard to answer because I think everybody approaches a work of art with their own experience and either knowledge of the situation, their aesthetic training or naivete, their inherent compassion fatigue or indifference. So it's hard to say, and also this is a huge variety of work that I can't really say generally how a person would respond. I think there are a number of strategies I think that are trying to get people to rethink and reconsider, not just the trauma, but how it is represented and how we learn and absorb this information. So hopefully it will make us more self-conscious, but not just for its own sake, but to activate us to the extent that any art can or cannot, activate us to actually change the situation. I think artists as are any creative beings, are in shaping consciousness, and then that filters into our actions. That we're not just artists, we're also citizens, and we're not just viewers, we're also citizens. But anything that motivates us or educates us to change the situation is sort of what I'm after, personally as an artist and in this kind of things I'm trying to organize. Yeah.
So looking at the ruin from the sort of 18th century perspective, right? I'm thinking about the idea of a ruin that is historical, and how figures like Gibbon and the late 18th century thought of ruins as ways of analyzing the present. Is there any distinction for you in this project between the really contemporary ruins and the more past ruins? Like I'm thinking of the photographs, images of sites from World War II that are now distant, versus things that are going on really at the moment. Does that affect the works? Does it affect your thinking on it?
I haven't thought as much about it, but there is a current show right now. I'm trying to get this. I actually have it on my desktop. There's a current show at the Tate right now called Ruin Lust, and there's this really great review in The Guardian that I actually have here.
I really want to visit that.
That talks about that. Talks about how painting is, particularly painting ruins of the past, is a way of enlarging the present, because the present can't be enlarged, or enlarging the past and the present. And that it's a kind of inducing of a terrible sublime of our smallness in the larger scope of things. But I was focusing on deliberate destruction and not the passage of time eroding.
I guess
things.
I'm just also thinking that it reflects the artist's perspective a bit. For example, an artist in Kabul dealing with these issues, making work reflecting the ruin, versus a Japanese artist looking at sites in Germany. There must be some different motivations to work, or no?
Oh, well, I would think there would be if you're directly impacted by the destruction and it's in your own time.
Well, there's also an aesthetic dimension to ruins. I mean, I'm going to invoke somebody I don't usually in public, but Albert Speer, who had this theory of ruin value and wanted significant buildings under the Hitler regime to be built out of stone because they make for better ruins than rebar and concrete. So he imagined, centuries hence, when the great party rally grounds and so forth would be crumbling into ruins and they'd be covered with beautiful vines and stuff, and rebar was not part of the discussion.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I want to cut you off, because in my own work, one thing I noticed in collecting all these images is the rebar and the concrete. And the place becomes anonymous. You have no idea where this rubble is because it's all rebar and concrete, and all the distinguishing features, all the ornamentation has been eradicated. And so part of what I was doing was trying to reinscribe the ornamentation that would distinguish the place or the people that once were there.
I mean, there's kind of a parallel in my mind between that, you know, the rebar versus the beautiful ruins. And also, I remember having discussions about this idea of beautiful suffering and looking at pictures from Abu Ghraib and stuff. And it's like the bodies from Abu Ghraib were so evacuated of a kind of higher, more exalted meaning. I mean, they were just reduced, you know. And that's kind of how I look at these. They're just reduced. It's a kind of difference, at least my empathic relationship to that is much different than these beautiful ruins from the 18th century that would make you speculate about the great civilizations that had been responsible for them. And so it's just like...
Well, it's interesting that you say that. I was in a recent symposium at Gettysburg College, and there was a Civil War historian that was talking about the kind of seductive aesthetic of war ruins, and that the word that was often used in the documents that she found was, isn't it grand? This adjective grand that might have been a substitute for like awe, and again this kind of after, I mean it was of their own time, but just watching the spectacle of it, the bomb flares looking like fireworks, and that there's this weird, terrible beauty in the ruins, and you know it's probably a interpretation of that, but one of the lines I love from Rilke is, "Beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror." And I have to confess, there's this strange aesthetic attraction too to this, just the chaos of the ruin, and when I detach myself from the fact that we made this happen, you know, but if I'm just looking at it in a detached way, I do find it aesthetically engaging, which is kind of disturbing. But I think that's part of like why that film, The Act of Killing, is engrossing too, because there's a weird, strange beauty, horror, repulsion going on that makes us very uncomfortable, because it allows us to recognize ourselves in some of those characters, even though we're horrified at the same time. And I think it's important to leave that space where it's not just this absolute pronouncement, you know, this is evil. I mean, of course war is evil. I don't mean to say that it's not, but how did this happen? You know, this, you know.
Along those lines, and something that seemed to me to work in regard to what you were just saying, could you go back to that image where you have the border, what's one of your own, and you have that border with the rubble? There were a couple of things, just while you're finding that, when I was thinking of Laos, where of course there was a war going on while I was there, and how to represent war and art was something that I never really thought about. And I wrote poetry, and I never wrote anything about the war aspects. I wrote about everything else. And so while you were going through this, I was trying to think, well, why was that, and the difficulty? But what I liked about that one that you have, if I were to do it, it would be something like what I saw it expressing. Yeah.
Okay.
And what I like about that is, you know, we've got the rubble and the war, and then there's this very light. You know, it's almost doesn't. It takes a little while to see that it's even there, the border, but it's like it whispers, and it sets up a tension, a whispered tension between the rubble of war and between other things that we do as humans. That we create things like that, and I don't mean in the sense of beautiful vast art, but just that we do things.
The act of creating itself. Yeah.
And that act of creating just says something about us, and also that we even if we're not creating it, how we appreciate it. And it puts in tension then on the one hand that loss, but because it whispers it works. It doesn't aggrandize either side of the rubble or the beauty that we were talking, because that was the tension we were talking about before. If you just have the rubble, then that's all. And if you have something that's beautiful, it kind of gets in the way, or it doesn't really speak. But this whisper, the idea that when I try to think of a word for it, is just that whispers to us both sides of the coin.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think too, it's in that in-between place where it appears to be structural and that it goes all the way up to the top and almost becomes like an arc, but it's impossible if you look at the perspective. You know, it's flat, but it's occupying two different points in space, so, you know, it's completely irrational too.
And that's what gives it somewhat that whispering.
Yeah, and it's, yeah.
So this kind of goes along the line with the temporal question, and mine is relative to the specificity versus the generality of ruins. And so you have different tactical moves from the artist. On the one hand, you've got Julie Meritou with the pieces from Berlin, and one seeing those in Exclusion could see them very much about layers and rubble, but then we also know that that is her general language.
I know.
And if we play that off as you were against the Norfolk pieces from Kabul with the cinema, and then you're talking about that specific place, and similarly when you have the Fosknot, who also is merging things from World War II and contemporary wars, versus Wafa Bilal, talking very specifically either about Baghdad or in Lebanon. So could you just talk a little bit more about the generality versus specificity of ruin?
Well, I mean, the specificity, I mean, okay, so the artists that are from the places that they're addressing, I think that, I think it certainly gives a kind of weight and authority to the pieces that, you know, comes from their direct experience. In my work, where I haven't been to the places, the specificity of, say, the ornamentation to me is a way of, you know, not just reminding us of a culture's presence, value, aspirations, but trying to, you know, remind us that this isn't just any place, it's some place. It's not just anybody that's being killed, it's somebody that's being killed. I think the generality, like, I agree with you about Meritou's work in particular because it looks a lot like all of her other pieces. So you could, you know, in her own writings and statements about the work, she's talking about Virilio and the Atlantic Wall and the fortifications in Berlin, and, you know, I'm taking her at face value, and through the titles of the work also. But in some ways it doesn't, it may not be my favorite work in the project, but I think that still has value in being open, that you could, she was actually trying to draw parallels between Berlin and Baghdad, that it could be any place in wartime or any city rebuilding itself. So, you know, people work in different places on the continuum from abstraction to figuration and generality to specificity. So, yeah, I don't know what else I can really say.
I think for me, I really agree with Fred. When I first started seeing your work, I've always been interested in how we process trauma. I don't actually do any of that in my own work. I mean, just through the act of making, I'm sure I'm processing. But I feel like even after reading the book, now, you know, having you present this stuff again, like it's very hard. Like I find it overwhelming. Like a lot of it was overwhelming. And, you know, this is heavy stuff. And for me, the most impactful thing is having a way in. And I do think that the aestheticism, this idea that we can be allowed to confront imagery on our own terms, but taking us in through beauty. You know, I mean, I think about the overwhelming repetition of imagery of like Syria or Egypt, or, you know, just these kinds of things where you realize I am being beaten up. And I can't take it, but I don't know how to, you know, detach enough from, you know, just what's going on in life to not be affected by that. And I think your work in particular for me is a respite, you know, and it helps me then to in terms of the specificity of some of these other artists who are, you know, they're there, they're bringing it through, and yet even still I find that difficult. You know, it doesn't, there's a point where I kind of break down and I can tell that I'm a little bit, it's too hard for me. So I mean, I think that all of this is a question, and we're all very different in how we can engage it. And everybody has a different level of their own trauma, personal and then collective, you know. And, you know, I'm not going to have the same level as a Syrian artist. But nonetheless, I think that in terms of a kind of a constructive moving forward, we all need this little bit of the ghosty dream to get our way in to the specific. I mean, that's so. I really appreciated the way that you put that, because I really feel that way every time I see your work.
Some of us were at the International, the Vietnamese American artist.
Thank you, Lay.
With where he contacted a lot of artists, artist soldiers in Vietnam, and who would make paintings of the different troops and then give them to the soldiers, or sometimes they were used for propaganda, but very often they were just distributed. And he would find copies of them on some of the artists he was talking to. These artists would find copies of these pictures on dead soldiers. What really interested me about it, though, and he pointed this out, that almost all of these paintings that were done by these soldier artists weren't really of the war directly. They were more of at times little oases of peace. And so you would have people sitting around talking, eating, somebody standing by their bicycle. And the thing was, there would be still all the hints of war. The clothing might be army fatigues that they had on, or there would be a rifle. So even though everything was in repose for a good deal of it, it was in the context of the war. And it was another way of saying, I mean, I would look at those and I would think of the fragility of it. The arms that you did see were very basic ones. And if you know, the vulnerability of these people, how much longer, well, in fact, that's one reason why they wanted these artists often to draw pictures of them, because they knew there'd be nothing left of themselves except that picture after it. But the fact that all these spoke so indirectly about the war, it came in really strong. And so this idea of whisper indirectness and how to...
Well, I mean, those I wasn't at that particular lecture. I went to the other one, but where he didn't talk as much about that. But so those drawings might be like little memorials, but I think they're also these testaments as to how life goes on during wartime. And that we often forget that, because, you know, whenever we think of an enemy, they just become this monolithic mass that are at war with us, or you know, but they're not, you know, gardening or cooking dinner, or, you know, and I think that's a way of keeping their humanity present, you know.
Which it did entirely.
And that's something that I liked about your other pieces, where you use bits and pieces from Islamic, you know, miniatures and so forth. And, you know, it so countervails against the stereotype, which of course is at the root of, you know, warlike behavior. And the stereotype with, you know, that's often associated with Islam is iconoclasm, you know, and destruction, right? And so here are all these traces of constructive activity that actually get accented in your work in a way that's very much counter to the scenes that they're embedded in, which is nice.
Yeah, and I do use a lot of just the decorative elements of Islamic art, and, you know, figurative art is not prevalent in Islamic art, but there were periods, and if it were in manuscript illumination or illustration, it was allowed at certain times. Where was I going with that? Oh, yeah, this one piece, I don't know, I didn't really talk about it, but this one here, where this figure is actually from the First School of Baghdad, and it's from the Book of Antidotes. So it was like a perfect connection to this this is an archaeological site that's been raided. This is called a robber hole. And you can tell because the sand is clear there. It's where the wind has blown the sand back into the hole that they've raided. And this is all the broken crockery from the archaeological site around. But he's gardening, and you know, for me that was, you know, obviously a symbol of regeneration.
I was struck that many of the images that you showed did not have human beings. That it's human trauma that is really the focus. But that it is, and I guess maybe it lines up with specific and general. I like the last slide with your border, or the borrowed border. I just, talk to me if I'm on the right track, but I think if you would inject in many of these images human beings shown suffering and collecting trauma, then it would be an easy way for the viewer to invest sympathy and empathy, and in effect it would stop there. So the specific would sort of relieve us of, you know, the burden of, you know, human tragedy. But because many of those are so general, and it could almost be really anywhere, it's almost like habitat for humanity rather than vessels of suffering individually. And so that, I really think that it is much more effective, and I think it may speak to some of the philosophical methodology that you had mentioned at the beginning, and I did not know those philosophers. But I think to invest in one single person suffering terribly would distract from the whole issue and would, you know, not be as powerful as really destruction, almost ecological human habitat destruction. That says a whole lot more. Is there a methodology there that's...
Well, I made a decision early on that I would Photoshop out the people that were in a lot of these scenes. I did a lot of cloning and covering them up because I just didn't feel I could do that, and unless I painted them in from past representations. And
I mean, that you're avoiding voyeurism there.
Which
is, but even beyond, I think these empty scenes of destruction just convey a lot more than the nice, easy solution of investing the viewer's feelings into a single human being that happens to be.
But I also think that we can't absorb it. It's what you talked about with the Abu Ghraib. Barbara mentioned it, you know, that when we see those kinds of figures, I think it's actually much harder to process. We're kind of, I mean, I'm thinking my own self, that it's not a way in for me. It actually just kind of shuts me right down. I can't.
I mean, I didn't show them in this lecture because it's not all about my work, but there is I do have a large number of works that include animals and birds in, but painted in, not photographic, because for me, they kind of show, in a sense, on one level, the oblivion of nature to war, that, you know, it's like they just cope. They just go nest in the rubble, or they fly over it, or they, you know, graze. It's an interesting kind of oblivion, but also a vulnerability that it reveals, but that I think if it were human, it would be different.
Near the end of our time, and I wanted to do two things. Julia had an announcement that I had actually asked her to make, and then I forgot it. Yeah, that's a discombobulated day for me.
Okay.
If you could do that, and then I want to come back to Suzanne.
Well, just, and this actually topically is somewhat related. It's not about war, but it is about buildings and demolition and asylum communities. The art history program at Duquesne is hosting its first visiting artist exhibition starting next week. And we are bringing Andrew Hairstons, who is an associate professor of art at Auburn University Montgomery. He has an MFA from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale and undergraduate art degrees from an institution in Glasgow, Scotland. I can't remember where. So he's from Glasgow. And he is showing a series he's working on called A Model for Asylum. which looks at this housing project, Red Road Flats in Glasgow. I don't know if any of you have heard of Red Road Flats. Apparently it's infamous and fascinating. It's a modernist social housing project, which is now under demolition. So he's been there, seen the buildings being demolished, but also done a lot of archival work into the original architectural drawings and spoken to various folks. And this was a community where many immigrants seeking asylum came to. So that's why I model for asylum. So he is speaking at 4:30 on March 25th, which is Tuesday next week, in the Africa Room in the Duquesne Union. And we will have the opening and a little reception following. So I'd love to have you. And if you can't come, then it's open for a month. It doesn't really have regular hours, but during the
But it's
day,
open during the day?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I saw a flyer for that somewhere.
We have some we have a student assistant curator who's out plastering the city with posters and various emails. But yeah, it's a really interesting abstract series, but based on research content. It's pretty fascinating.
I think that I wanted to close with one last question to Suzanne from whoever still has a question.
Well, she kind of asked the question I was going to ask about, the little human representation. But maybe I'll just sort of build off of it. And it's not that sort of human suffering can't be represented in art, but it's kind of difficult for the reasons that they were bringing up. And certainly some images would be too graphic to show in art and things like that. I'm curious what you think about the difficulties of showing some of the other sides of war, not just the ruin or the human cost, but there's always sort of an economic cost and a cultural cost, and maybe even just capturing the viscerality of it too. I mean, no photographer can be there as the bomb is dropped because they wouldn't last for very long if they were. But some of the images that are near impossible or more difficult to capture from war, some of the other traumas. Maybe if you could comment a bit on that.
Well, there are many documentary photographers. There's a really good site, the Noor photographers, N-O-O-R, that often document people living during wartime. And at the beginning of this I have probably 60 other artists with work that could have fit this theme. And I just felt like I had to narrow it in order, and it's already a lot of art. It's like over 40 artists already. And maybe I thought at times I'm just being too literal because I really want there to be physical rubble somewhere in the image, just as a something that would anchor it across all these stylistic approaches and conceptual approaches. So that was just, for my own framing focus. But because I think there are a lot of other places that do the straight documentation, which does, I think, present the visceral, those pictures of Abu Ghraib or, and also, of course, there have been artists that have shown very graphic human suffering in powerful ways. Goya's Disasters of War is like every artist that deals with war can't help but be impacted by that work, and it's still just as alive, And there are contemporary artists doing responses to Goya's Disasters of War, so it's living on through that too. So I think there are lots of approaches to this. This is just my take.
Go ahead, were you going to follow up?
Oh, just are there any particular approaches that you think maybe or just if you could come to some of the difficulties of the other approaches, or some of the there may be too broad a question.
Well, it's difficult for a lot of the reasons that have been stated. Is that how explicit can you be without turning off the viewer, repelling them, or exploiting the imagery in a sensational way, because this culture particularly has a fascination with death and violence and sex, and it's too easy to fall into that territory. I think there are artists that do tread the fine line though, or photographers. But yeah, even photographers get a lot of grief. There's all kinds of response to Salgado's work, who photographed the Pulitzer Prize winning photographer that shot the photograph of the starving child with the vulture waiting. And they all said, why didn't you do something? Why were you waiting for the vulture? Well, she was far gone. He ended up committing suicide, whether it was from everything he saw or from the criticism that he got for that, I don't really know. But you know, there's lots of literature out there, you know, about this kind of work that does get more graphic and explicit. And yeah.
One thing as we're coming to our end here, we have a video of everything that's taken place, so that'll be put up on our website. And I think we'll need to get your PowerPoint presentation geared into it, because that's actually not capturable by the camera, just me and talking. So Nathan does this, actually synchronizes the two, so that'll be up so that we can get to a lot of other people that weren't able to make it today as well. And in fact, there's also some other aspects of the university institutions that will want to show it too. So I want to thank you very much. This was tremendously effective and effective as well. And to be able to do art and to be able to talk about it is a wonderful combination. So I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.